In 1984, the Labour Party campaigned and won on promises of reducing unemployment and the nuclear-free policy. However, in the weeks following the election, Labour changed direction. Longy was pressured by both Treasury officials and Finance Minister Roger Douglas to take swift action to overcome an impending economic crisis.
There will be some pain. Some of that pain may well elicit the odd scream.
Douglas believed drastic changes were needed to make New Zealand competitive again on the international stage. The reforms that followed, privatisation, deregulation and the taking away of tariffs, all followed closely the formula set down by neoliberalism.
There will be no fiscal blowout in this country while I am Minister of Finance.
And if you look at the tiered rolling out of the neoliberal reforms, the first thing that was done was the disentangling to a large extent of government involvement in prices within the system or within the national economy. So you had the assault on SMPs and in the agricultural sector, a big move to remove all forms of tariff and subsidy.
Demolished our car industry just overnight almost. In fact, literally overnight. We took the last tariffs off new imports of cars, and the 4 car assembly plants in New Zealand closed down the next week, I think, very quickly. It was just goodbye and gone. It's inefficient for us to have a car industry, so we'll just get rid of it and import the cars. Trouble is, we did that with everything else, so we were importing everything and not making it.
Government entanglement in prices, then try and take out as much as you could government out of ownership of national resources. You have the privatisation wave in the New Zealand context, corporatisation followed by privatisation, the forests, the Bank of New Zealand, the airline, and you can string them all out.
Looking back on this period, many have asked whether this reform is necessary or even inevitable. Approaching this issue through the theories of international political economy allows us to better analyse this question.
One theory would suggest that New Zealand's reforms were somewhat inevitable is the neo-Gramscian theory as developed by Robert Cox. Emphasising the centrality of small elites in creating government policy, Cox theorises that the interests of these individuals will dominate. Applying this suggests that given the right personalities and access to power, their self-interest in neoliberalism would make such policy almost inevitable.
There was also a number of personalities that invariably in politics, I think, play an important role. One, of course, was that there was a new generation of young Labour leaders coming into the scene in the early 1980s. They were very influenced by what they saw in the United States and Britain and elsewhere, the free market reforms. They realised that the sort of policies that Labour had traditionally gone with were not policies that they believed would solve the problems. And so what they did then was they were influenced by top civil servants in Treasury and elsewhere to bring in a totally fresh approach, and that's what Labour did in 1984.
The neo-Gramscian ideological consensus amongst elites in society was better able to be implemented in New Zealand due to the nature of the electoral system.
Roger Douglas and the Treasury officials all steered policy in New Zealand, and the structure of New Zealand government, with little checks and balances, also contributed to this power.
Well, what it meant, what the kind of lean and simple political structure in New Zealand allowed the Labour government to do was to bring in its reforms very quickly indeed. Roger Douglas, who was Minister of Finance, argued that the only way forward was really, to plant your foot on the accelerator and go for it. And they did that in the 1980s with a whole series of reforms that they could pass through Parliament simply because they had a majority. Labour had a majority in Parliament, so it could push through all its reforms. In many other countries, particularly federal systems, it was a much slower process than it was in New Zealand, but because Cabinet dominated Parliament and Labour was in a majority in Parliament as a single party, it could force through all of these reforms.
One of the reasons I did it so quickly was before anyone could stop them, i.e. the electorate. And so that was unfortunate as well. So you could say first past the post plus a short electoral cycle encouraged sort of extreme rapid measures in New Zealand.
Long wave theory is another theory that can be used to argue for the inevitability of neoliberal reforms in New Zealand. Ever since quantitative suggested the idea of long waves, many theorists have been attracted to the idea that there are cyclical transformations in the market system.
Long wave theory sees capitalism as developing in a series of great leaps forward. When there is a time of political or economic crisis, such as in the 1970s, long wave theory argues that new institutions need to be developed in order to build the platform for a growth spurt.
I see the long wave stuff not as sort of a trendless historical long cycle, if indeed it exists as that at all, but as a series of major ideological shifts, usually in response to a problem, dealing with a certain problem, then creating a new problem which we don't have any theory for.
John Maynard Keynes' solution to the problems of the Great Depression was more active involvement by the state in stabilising economies. However, this came with a price. By the 1970s, Keynesian policies have resulted in rising levels of inflation.
There's never been slow, steady, incremental inflation like we had in the West. So the monetarists came charging back in and said, inflation, that's the real problem of capitalism. We've got to deal with that. And these Keynesians have caused inflation by their slack policies. So the monetarists took over Friedmanites and stuff. And they hit inflation on the head pretty hard. And they did. And they drove it out of the system for about 5 to 10 years. They said, right, we won.
The victory of neoliberalism was even more inevitable because of the Washington Consensus that developed after the 70s. International organisations such as the IMF made third world countries adopt neoliberal policies in order to get money. This resulted in the spread of economic liberalisation around the world. While neo-Gramscian and long-wave theory seem to indicate that the triumph of neoliberalism was an inevitable outcome of market forces, Andrew Gamble in Spectre of the Feast appears to disagree.
It was not inevitable. A number of political, economic and ideological interventions and circumstances combined to make it possible.
While the 1970s was a difficult time for the global and New Zealand economy, neoliberalism was not the only option. There are a range of other economic models to choose from.
Not a lot that New Zealand could have done to have sustained the same structures as it had prior to the 1980s. But it didn't. It didn't need to install parental choice in schools, as one example.
The theories of economic nationalism and mercantilism offered New Zealand an alternative approach to neoliberal reforms in that they suggested an active state. The Anglo-American capitalist system was also, in the 1980s, under threat from the investment-based Japanese and German economies. And finally, there was also the remote possibility of communism, which was still an active force in the 1980s. In the end, none of these alternatives were adopted, and with the fall of communism, neoliberalism reigned supreme. New Zealand has always been a bit ahead of the pack. Women's suffrage, the welfare state, nuclear-free policy. Likewise, New Zealand embraced neoliberal reform quickly and wholeheartedly in the 1980s.
Right, we moved from the furthest left to the furthest right in about 6 years, 7 years. It's extraordinary.
There's no denying our nation's love affair with neoliberalism. The trend in the global political economy towards liberalisation has affected all countries, but none quite so much as New Zealand.